It is 1314, and the footsteps of the English army on the march to Stirling Castle are all that break the silence. Suddenly, an army of Scots appear out the trees, rushing down onto the English. Before they know what has happened, countless English soldiers lay dead, and the king only just escapes with his life. Robert the Bruce has just struck the defining blow against the English, ending their presence north of the border and setting the foundations for the recognition of an independent Scotland. Later branded a traitor by Hollywood in the film Braveheart, this is the true story of Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. Robert I, commonly known as Robert the Bruce, was born on the 11th of July 1274. Son of Robert the Bruce, the 6th Lord of Annandale, and Marjorie the Countess of Carrick. Importantly, Robert's great-grandfather was King David, the first of Scotland, and this was where he drew his claim to the Scottish throne from. The location of his birth is not known for sure, however it most likely have been Turnberry Castle in Ayrshire, Scotland, the seat of the Earls of Carrick. This would be where he spent most of his youth, being brought up in the mixed culture of Anglo-Norman and Gaelic. As a result of the upbringing, he would most likely have been trilingual, speaking the Anglo-Norman language, Gaelic, and the early Scots language. As a senior individual, he would have also had knowledge of Latin, which would have allowed Robert to have a basic education in law, politics, scripture, philosophy, and history. It has been suggested this early learning sparked a passion in Robert, and he took pleasure in learning throughout his life. It is said that later he would recite tales of history to his supporters, and a parliamentary briefing document backed this claim, asserting he would continually read or always have something to read in his presence about history of ancient kings and princes. As a young lord, he and his 4 brothers would also have had masters to teach them practical skills of the time, such as horsemanship and swordsmanship, amongst others. During Robert's youth, the Great Cause occurred, with Robert's father one of the claimants to the throne. In an oversimplification, King Edward of England was asked to decide the King of Scotland, and he chose John Balliol, the first cousin once removed of Robert's grandfather. This would start a large rift between the Bruces and the King of Scotland, who they deemed a usurper to the throne. This selection of Balliol caused Robert's grandfather to retract his claim to the throne, passing it to Robert's father, whilst he subsequently resigned his earldom of Carrick, passing this to Robert, who then became the Earl of Carrick. After John Balliol ascended to the throne, supported by his allies, the Comyn family, arguably the most powerful family in Scotland at the time, the relationship between the King of Scotland and the King of England rapidly deteriorated. Robert and his father wasted no time aligning the Bruces with the King of England against the usurper, and were joined by other powerful Scottish families in the Earls of Angus and March. The final straw in his power struggle came when King Edward demanded Scottish troops join the English in a campaign against France. Naturally, Balliol instead allied with the French. As a result of these rising hostilities, the Bruces withdrew to Carlisle in England, protected by King Edward, with Balliol seizing Robert and his father's estates, giving them to John Comyn. This was an escalation of rivalry between Robert and John Comyn, which would define the next 10 years of his life. During these events, Robert would marry his first wife, Isabella of Mar, with whom he'd have a daughter, Marjorie. It is interesting to note at this point that an individual who is remembered as a liberator of Scotland was more closely aligned with England and seemed to hold no negative views towards them. The first blow of this campaign was struck by 7 Scottish lords led by John Comyn against Carlisle. Whilst an attack occurred, the lack of siege weaponry left the attack unsuccessful, and it appears to have been more of a direct attack against the Bruces by Comyn and his allies than necessarily against the English. Edward I quickly retaliated, taking the town of Berwick in March 1296. This was followed up at the Battle of Dunbar, where Scottish resistance was effectively ended. Edward deposed John Balliol, putting him in the Tower of London, and instead installed Englishmen to govern Scotland. For Bruce and his family, this meant they were now back in possession of their lands in Annandale and Carrick. To reduce Scottish animosity, Edward gathered 1,500 Scots at Berwick, where they swore an oath of fealty. Both Robert and his father were present, swearing the oath to the man they had sided with previously. In July 1297, another Scottish revolt against the English broke out, this time led by James Stewart. However, this time Robert the Bruce was amongst their numbers. It appears that Robert had acted independently from his family, as his father played no part and once again withdrew to Carlisle. Sources suggest that Robert had been influenced by his grandfather's friends, Wishart and Stewart, who had inspired him to rebel. While sources vary, Bruce appears to have been among the leaders, heading to his lands of Annandale and raising his knights to join the cause. Attempts were made to get Robert to switch his allegiance back to King Edward, with letters sent urging him to support the Earl of Surrey, commander of Edward's forces, to which he was related. This revolt was quickly quelled, with an agreement known as the Capitulation of Irvine signed. Scottish lords would now not have to serve across the sea against their will, and were pardoned for their violence in exchange for once again swearing allegiance to Edward. Some, however, refused, such as William Wallace, who continued fighting until the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, following which King Edward reassigned the lands of Scottish lords to his followers. For an unknown reason, the Bruce's lands of Carrick and Annandale were not amongst those distributed, allowing Robert to continue to hold his power. There are rumours at this time that Robert fought for King Edward at the Battle of Falkirk, but there is no evidence to suggest this, with Robert's name notably being absent on the Falkirk roll of nobles. These early uprisings go some way to show that whilst Robert would later be known for Scottish independence, this early desire to fight was more self-serving and focused upon gaining the Scottish crown, which he deemed rightfully his as opposed to Scottish liberation. With their defeat at the Battle of Falkirk, the Scottish revolt had all but ended, with William Wallace resigning as the Guardian of Scotland. In an attempt to calm the situation, both Bruce and long-time rival John Comyn were assigned the joint Guardians of Scotland in his place. This, however, was short-lived. Both Robert and John struggled to see past their personal differences and their rival claims to the throne, which naturally led them to being enemies. King Edward thought he could calm the situation by appointing a third guardian in the form of William Lamberton, the Bishop of St Andrews. Lamberton was meant to be a neutral who could steady the ship in stormy waters. However, this was unsuccessful, and in 1300 Robert resigned, being replaced by the Earl of Angus. Again, this was short-lived, and all three existing guardians resigned, being replaced by Sir John de Saules, a patriot who wanted King John Balliol to sit back on the Scottish throne. In July 1301, Edward once again began a campaign into Scotland, during which he captured a few minor castles. However, he did little damage to the Scots' fighting abilities, agreeing a 9-month truce in January 1302. Robert once again submitted to Edward, along with other Scottish nobles, despite the fact during the conflict he had been fighting on the side of Scotland, again showing Robert's wavering loyalties. Around this time, rumours appeared that John Balliol would return to the throne, supported by Saules, a blow to Robert's claim. However, nothing came of these rumours. At this time, Bruce married his second wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, daughter of the second Earl of Ulster, after his first wife had passed away. This truce would be short-lived, and once again Edward started another campaign into Scotland in 1303. This time, Edward had more success, reaching Edinburgh before moving to Perth, where he stayed until July. He then proceeded north through Dundee, Brecon and Montrose before reaching Aberdeen, where he arrived just a month later. After which, he retraced his steps, having subdued Scotland, whereby all leading Scots excluding Wallace had surrendered in February 1304. In a blow to Robert, Comyn was once again appointed Guardian of Scotland and submitted to King Edward. To make matters worse, with Edward's success the laws and liberties of Scotland were retracted to those in the days of Alexander III, and any adjustments would need to be by Edward's assent, reducing Scottish power. It is said that in response in June 1304, Bruce and Lamberton made a pact, interpreted as a sign of patriotism, despite their surrender to Edward, and if one broke this pact, they would pay the other £10,000. By 1305, Robert's father had died, and he was now not only the Earl of Carrick, but also the 7th Lord of Annandale, holding vast estates and property in Scotland, as well as a barony and some minor land in England, placing himself in a powerful position. Taking advantage of this during the summer of 1305, Robert made an agreement with his rival Comyn, whereby he would give up his lands to Comyn if he led an uprising in Scotland, and in exchange, Comyn would give up his claim to the Scottish throne, paving the way for Robert to be the only real claimant to the Scottish throne. In what appears to be a very obvious twist, Comyn betrayed this agreement to Edward, whilst Robert was at the English court, and Edward planned to arrest Robert. However, Edward's son-in-law, Ralph de Monthermer, learned of the plan and sent Robert 12 pence and a pair of spurs. Robert took the hint and fled back to Scotland. After revenge, Robert and Comyn met in the Chapel of Greyfriars in Dumfries in February 1306. Robert led the conversation, accusing him of telling Edward of the agreement. The argument escalated, coming to blows in front of the altar, with two possible accounts given of what happened next. In one, Robert stabbed Comyn, but he failed to kill him. However, on being told Comyn survived, two of his supporters went and finished the job. Alternatively, Robert drew his sword and hit Comyn over the head, whereby his supporters ran up and stabbed him to death. Either way, the result was the same. Robert had eliminated his rival for the throne, and was now the best placed claimant, with no option but to move forward. Robert decided for his first move he would attack Dumfries Castle. The English quickly surrendered, from which he hurried to Glasgow, where his friend and supporter, Bishop Wishart, granted him absolution and rallied the clergy to Robert. At this time, Robert was also excommunicated by the Pope for the attack on Comyn in front of the altar. 6 weeks after killing Comyn, Robert was crowned King of the Scots by Lamberton at Scone on Palm Sunday 1306. He had finally gotten what he wanted, the crown of Scotland. The war would not start well when Robert and his followers were surprised by the Lord of Pembroke and his men. This was a direct mistake of a chivalrous Robert, who had earlier in the day asked Pembroke to come out of Perth Castle and battle, to which the reply was, "It is too late today, let's battle tomorrow." Pembroke had a reputation for being an honourable man, so Robert and his men made camp and laid down their weapons. Pembroke and his men, acting under a command of no mercy from King Edward, launched a surprise attack, slaughtering many loyal followers. Robert himself was unhorsed 3 times, but was saved each time before eventually escaping. As a result, Robert sent his wife, daughters and other women of the party to Kildrummy under the protection of his brother Neil, whilst Robert and a small loyal following including his brothers Thomas, Alexander and Edward all disappeared. A force led by Edward, Prince of Wales, soon to be Edward II, took Kildrummy Castle, sending Bruce's wife and daughters to live under the harshest possible conditions, whilst executing his younger brother. Where Robert fled to following his defeat is a mystery, but he would likely stay there until February 1307. The most likely possibilities given are the Hebrides or Ireland. Less likely, but plausible possibilities, lie in the Orkney Islands under Norwegian rule, or Norway itself as his sister was Queen Dowager. What we do know is that Robert and his party returned in 2 groups. Himself and his brother Edward landed in the southwest of Scotland, beginning a guerrilla war, whilst his other brothers, Thomas and Alexander, landed further south. This was short-lived, however, as they were soon captured and executed. Robert soon began to pick up steam, winning a small battle at Glentrool before defeating the Earl of Pembroke at the Battle of Loudon Hill, whilst Robert's supporter James Douglas made his first attack, burning his own castle in Douglasdale. From here, Robert left his brother Edward in command in Galloway, travelling north capturing Inverloch and Urquhart castles, then burning Inverness and Nairn to the ground. He then attempted, but failed, to take Elgin. During this time, Edward I died on 7th of July 1307, and his son Edward II taking command of the war against Robert. In late 1307, Robert decided to redirect his force to Aberdeenshire, threatening Banff, before falling ill. Whilst recovering, Robert and his forces moved back west to take more castles, before again failing to take Elgin. During this stage of the campaign, Robert and his forces were under pressure from John Comyn, the Earl of Buchan, the cousin of the previously murdered John Comyn. This was Robert's chance to remove his greatest rivals, and he duly did so at the Battle of Barra. John Comyn fled to England, and Robert, conscious of the strong support Comyn still held, began what was referred to as the Harrying of Buchan. This involved Robert commanding his brother Edward to lay waste to Buchan from end to end. For months Edward harried Buchan, killing any who resisted Robert's rule, burning cities and castles to the ground. These violent acts prevented any hostility to Robert's rule and succeeded in removing any loyalty that remained to the Commons. Questions remain around how this success occurred, as Robert lacked numbers and siege weapons, and historians suggest it was perhaps more to do with a lack of confidence and belief from Comyn and his supporters. Following this success and the destruction of Buchan, Robert and his men crossed to Argyll and defeated the MacDougals at the Battle of the Pass of Brander, who were allies of the Commons, taking Dunstafnish Castle, the last major stronghold for the Commons and their supporters. A harrying like that in Buchan then followed in Argyll. In March 1309, Robert held his first parliament at St Andrews, and by August he controlled all Scotland north of the River Tay. The following year, the clergy recognised Robert as king despite his excommunication. Shortly after, Robert's excommunication from the Pope for murdering Comyn was lifted. In 1310, Robert wrote to Edward II to negotiate peace, but was rejected. So over the next 3 years, Robert continued a campaign against English-held towns and castles, capturing Perth in 1311. He also began to make raids into northern England, and landed and captured the Isle of Man. A large part of Robert's success was that in the past 8 years of war, Robert had managed to avoid meeting the English on the battlefield, instead operating a more guerrilla battle plan. By 1314, Robert had captured most castles in Scotland and was raiding as far south as Carlisle. Getting sick of Robert, Edward II planned a campaign, mustering between 15 to 20,000 soldiers. In the spring, Edward Bruce, Robert's brother, began laying siege to Stirling Castle, which agreed to surrender if not relieved before the 24th of June 1314. Alongside this, other supporters like James Douglas captured Roxburgh, and Randolph captured Edinburgh Castle, whilst Robert himself in May once again raided the Isle of Man. All the pieces were falling into place for a united, independent Scotland under Robert. However, knowledge of the Stirling Agreement reached King Edward, who began marching his troops to Stirling to prevent its surrender. Getting wind of this, Robert began to prepare his troops made up primarily of spearmen to prevent Edward from reaching Stirling. What would occur would be Robert's greatest military victory. The battle began at Bannockburn on the 23rd of June, with the English army trying to force its way across the high ground surrounded by marshland. During some early skirmishing, Robert killed Sir Henry de Bohun, grandson of the Earl of Hereford, in personal combat, displaying his own fighting ability. The following day, Edward continued his advance, when the bulk of the Scottish army emerged from the woods. The English were ill prepared, not expecting the Scots to give battle in this location, and were proceeding in marching order. The archers were at the back of this formation, and unable to break up the Scottish spear formations, who quickly overwhelmed the ineffective English cavalry in the cramped, swampy terrain, before Robert and his men quickly overran the rest of the English. As the English leaders failed to regain control, King Edward was dragged from the battlefield, nearing capture from the Scottish. With the Scottish forces in hot pursuit, King Edward retreated, eventually getting to the safety of York. After this victory, Stirling Castle fell quickly to Robert and his men. This was in effect the end of the wars against England for Robert. His greatest hour had passed, and he would now go down in the annals of history, having masterminded a great Scottish victory over the English, just as Wallace had done 17 years earlier at Stirling Bridge. He now turned his attention to other issues. Free from serious English threats in Scotland, Robert and his armies repelled an attempt by the English to get into Scotland and began to raid the north of England in Yorkshire and Lancashire. Not content in just defeating the English in Scotland, Robert sent his only surviving brother Edward to Ireland to assist Irish lords against the English incursions, and opening a second front against the English. Edward was even crowned as the High King of Ireland in 1316. These Irish incursions can be explained by Robert's ideological vision of a pan-Gaelic Greater Scotia, where his lineage would rule over both Scotland and Ireland. This belief was aided by two key factors. Firstly, his marriage alliance from his marriage in 1302 with the De Burgh family of the Earldom of Ulster, and secondly, Robert on his mother's side was descended from Gaelic royalty. This belief succeeds to a small extent in Ulster, where the Scots had some support, but otherwise was ineffective. Militarily, however, there was initial success with the combined Scottish-Irish forces defeating the English and burning their towns numerous times. However, in the long term, this was a failure, as non-Ulster chiefs did not support the Scots and a famine hit Ireland. This famine meant the armies of both England and Scotland were pillaging and raising settlements in desperation for the supplies. The Irish therefore saw both the Scottish and English forces as occupiers, no different from each other. The final nail in the coffin was the death of Robert's brother Edward at the Battle of Falkirk, ending Robert's moves into Ireland. Robert, however, did have some diplomatic achievements. These include the Declaration of Arbroath of 1320, written by Scottish barons to the Pope, constituting Robert's response to the excommunication for disobeying the Pope's demand for a truce in 1317, and asserted the independence of the Kingdom of Scotland. As a result of this, the Pope lifted Robert's excommunication. More importantly for Robert, however, was the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton by King Edward III of England in 1328. This recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom, with Robert as its king. Robert had been suffering from a serious illness from at least 1327, with some accounts suggesting leprosy. However, this is heavily debated, and the term leprosy was used very loosely by 14th century writers, and can more likely be attributed to any kind of major skin disease. There is little evidence of what this illness could have really been from the king or his physicians, but there is no evidence of any attempt to separate the king from friends, family, or even foreign diplomats, which was commonplace for lepers. The fact it was not leprosy was confirmed when a team of researchers examined a foot bone in the original casting of his skull. Robert appears to have known he was near his end, and went on a final pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Ninian at Whithorn, perhaps searching for a miracle cure or to make peace with God. Multiple sources from the time state that Robert summoned his prelates and barons for a final council, where he made large gifts to religious houses and foundations so they may pray for his soul and repent for his failure to fulfil a vow to undertake a crusade against the Saracens in the Holy Land. On the 7th of June, 1329, at the manor of Cardross, Robert the Bruce died. As per his wishes, his body was buried in 3 places, with the body in Dunfermline Abbey, the heart at Melrose Abbey, and his embalmed viscera at St. Cerf's Church in Dumbarton. Robert the Bruce had united and created an independent Scotland, free from the English and dispatched rivals to the throne. However, whilst a recognisable figure with a lot of praise in Scotland and the independence movements, his legacy has been tarnished by Hollywood. The film Braveheart has somewhat spoilt his legacy, portraying Robert as a traitor to Scotland and Wallace. Whilst at the time, it would appear Robert was more interested in the crown than independence, he did change his view as he aged, and was ultimately successful where Wallace was not, in gaining independence. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed. If you have, please consider subscribing. I aim to put one of these videos out every Sunday. If you would like more information about others who fought England, then please consider watching my video on Owain Glyndwr, the last Prince of Wales.